Anne Brensley is a selectwoman from the town of Wayland, running to become the next lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. Anne also happens to be a small property owner herself. Along with Anne, who gave us permission to address her by her first name, we'll be joined by SPOA Vice President Tony Lopes and news reporter Scott Van Voorhees, who edits the independent newspaper Contrarian Boston. As written in that publication, if Anne wins in November, she'll likely be the first person to hold that office who has experience taking calls from tenants in the winter when the heat has gone out. As an organization, SPOA does not endorse political candidates. Therefore, this conversation is not an endorsement of Anne's campaign by SPOA. We bring you this information for educational purposes so that you can get to know the candidates and vice versa. SPOA also issues an open invitation to all candidates to speak with us, whether they're running for lieutenant governor or any other office. But ultimately, it remains up to you, the voters, to decide upon the merits of the candidates' positions. Anne will discuss her views on housing, including her thoughts on the rent control ballot question. Where does she stand on the importance of including and collaborating with the small property owners who provide 65% of the rental housing in Massachusetts? Also, should the supporters of the ballot question be careful what they wish for? Hello, everyone. My name is Amir Shahsavari. I'm the president of the Small Property Owners Association, also known as SPOA, which brings you episode 22 of SPOA Housing Policy Series. This is where we discuss property rights and all things real estate. I'm pleased to welcome Miss Anne Brensley, who's running for Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. Great to have you, Anne.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mr. Tony Lopes is the vice president of SPOA. Great to see you, Tony. Thank you for coming on.
Good to be here. Thank you, Amir.
Mr. Scott Van Voorhees is a news reporter and the founding editor of the independent newspaper Contrarian Boston. Great to have you back, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, I just want to remind you kindly to donate to the Small Property Owners Association. You can do that by going to spoa.com/join. That's www.spoa.com/join. We work hard to advocate for property rights while promoting reasonable solutions, balanced solutions that help renters, property owners, and all other stakeholders in housing. But we can't do that without your help. So please remember to donate at spoa.com/join. Anne, I'll turn it over to you. Could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you're running for lieutenant governor?
Yeah, absolutely. Currently I'm the select woman for Wayland, Massachusetts, but professionally I started my career in investments. I got all of my securities exams completed, and I actually bought my first property when I was 22, 23 years old. And so I got exposed to real estate very, very early on, and I started my own business doing investments when I was 29. And I do a ton. I've been running that for over 15 years now. And that company focuses a lot on pre-development, which includes land development and doing very, very early stage venture projects. I love all of the things that are complex out in the investment world. And so from a candidacy standpoint, I looked at the lieutenant governor position. I had a vision for it. I kind of saw this gap between, policies that were coming down from the state level into the local communities, into business owners, small business owners. And I saw that there was a big disconnect on what the policies were intended to do and what they were actually doing in impacting people's lives. And I see the lieutenant governor position as a bridge to that, as a possible solution going forward, of being able to make sure that policy matches what people are really looking for.
Well, first of all, congratulations on starting so early as a business person. That's incredible. And you answered a question I was going to ask with regard to the office of Lieutenant Governor. What made you look at that particular office and how you feel you could change it or redefine it? And that's fascinating. Congratulations. Also,
Thank you.
I'm sure you're aware too that we're facing a ballot question to reinstate rent control after 32 years in Massachusetts. What are your thoughts on that policy?
Well, I think I come at that policy with a very unique position because I actually grew up in New York City. And so rent control was something that I had a chance from a very early age to understand the pros and cons of it. And I can tell you that any city, especially a major city, especially a city like Boston or even Worcester and some of the cities that you see throughout Massachusetts, the long-term impacts of rent control are nothing what you expect them to be. Right. So you expect that the intent of rent control is to reduce long-term rent rates. And in fact, it becomes a very short-term solution that tends to be a band-aid that has way deeper and long-term impacts that are negative in the real estate market. And so I got to see that play out throughout my entire life. So I can tell you, for those who see the pros of it, the pros do not at all outweigh the cons on the policies.
Right, there is commonality there because I too was a child of the rent control era in Boston. My mother, a small property owner, struggled a great deal at that time because she could not collect her rental income. She was dealing with a tenant who was willfully not paying while vandalizing the property, chasing away all the cooperative tenants so that he could take over the building himself. In the meantime, the property simply fell into disrepair. And a lot of owners had that problem because they couldn't safely maintain their properties anymore. And then, due to the discouragement in investment, the housing shortage got worse, which only led to further increases in rent for the tenants. Some people may recall if they were tenants, if they left an apartment, they had a difficult time finding other places to move to because many tenants simply stayed in place and they were afraid to move because they weren't sure due to the shortage if they could find any other place. And so one can go on about that, but I can definitely relate. I saw what she went through and I saw how much better things got for her and her renters after the policy was banned at the ballot box in Massachusetts. Tony, I'll turn it over to you on this subject of rent control. Do you have any questions for Anne or any comments?
Sure. So on the topic of rent control, what's been your history? I'm curious more so as a property owner, and your position on rent control.
In general, I don't see long-term positive gains with rent control. So I would oppose a rent control policy in Massachusetts. And what was just brought up by Amir is really important. Massachusetts had it, and then it didn't work, and they changed the policy. New York City had it, and they maintained it. And what you're seeing right now is this terrible trap where they feel like they have so many people dependent on the system itself that dismantling it is becoming a problem. It's not even that people disagree that rent control and especially Manhattan needs to be dismantled. It's literally they don't know how to do it because when you get into a position where so many people are relying on it, and you're now talking about a population that a lot of these individuals have aged into these homes, right? And so the last thing New York City or anybody wants to do as a city is all of a sudden take uh, the aging population and say, hey, you got to get out of here. And by the way, we don't have a place to put you. And so I think Massachusetts was able to kind of navigate, hey, this policy isn't working. Let's change it. This idea of going back to it, I understand what the real underlying problem is. The underlying problem is that rent is really high and we need to address that. But I promise you this is not the solution.
And before I turn it over to Scott, I was curious too. How do you think this policy would affect people who are not involved in rental real estate? You know, the average voter who owns a single family home, who's obviously neither a renter nor a rental property owner. What would happen to those average homeowners and their properties, their property values? And this is open to all of you.
I think from the property value standpoint, unfortunately, a lot of these properties get essentially abandoned at certain points because there's no ability to invest in those properties themselves. And then for the individual homeowner, the one that is sitting there just operating their home and they're seeing their neighborhood is turning to rent control, I can tell you that the demand and the supply balance that people assume will happen. Hey, maybe rents are going down. Will that pull other rents down? Actually, what ends up happening is for people who come into the state, they actually get priced out because prices for newcomers, for new renters, goes up. And so then all of a sudden, by having a market, what would traditionally be a market rate property, it actually becomes more difficult to rent out. So again, I think the theme is going to be that it feels like a band-aid and a good immediate fix, and then the longer term impacts are negative.
And do you think that property taxes may likely go through the roof for these single family homeowners in situations where, let's say, local government they can't collect, especially in a city like Boston, where a lot of the revenue that the city government gets comes from real estate taxes. If they can't tap into that anymore because property values are crashing, where else are they going to turn to get the revenue? I mean, do you think the average taxpayer should be mindful of this?
I would say absolutely. I don't want to, monopolize the conversation because I'm sure other people have thoughts, but I think people will agree with me that absolutely. And what's almost sad in Massachusetts right now is that a lot of communities in general, a lot of towns and municipalities are struggling with increased costs in general, and so they're increasing taxes as a revenue solution. And so it's almost becoming difficult to see how policies like rent control will even increase those taxes by a certain amount. But I can tell you that unfortunately, a policy like this will increase taxes.
Thank you, Scott. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Amir. And so, what's your assessment of the current Lieutenant Governor, Kim Driscoll, the governor? Are they doing, and they have come out against the rent control
Rent control.
question, but are they doing enough? And what should they be doing about this question that, as we've been discussing, would really have some really grave implications for rents and housing availability and property values and many other things.
Well, obviously, from just being somebody who's running against Kim Driscoll, right? I obviously don't agree with her overall policies and way of thinking. And so the fact that we both agree that rent control is not the solution to me doesn't negate the fact that the administration in general has not done a good job of understanding how basic capitalism and removing red tape and allowing kind of the market to flow in fact can be the best solution for the market. So instead, you're seeing a significant amount of overreach by the state into local communities when it comes to real estate under this idea that, hey, the state knows how to create housing better. But when you look at something like the MBTA Communities Act and you say, okay, there's a housing crunch. Well, let me tell you the three locations where housing crunch is the worst. It's in Western Mass, it's in Boston, and it's in the Worcester area. And then you look at what the state has done to try to solve that problem. And the MBTA Communities Act is supposed to be their paramount solution. But the MBTA Communities Act does not address the western part of the state. It actually excludes Boston, and two of the communities that surround Worcester are actually part of the lawsuit to get rid of the MBTA Communities Act. So unfortunately, I think this is nothing more than us attorneys, both Kim Driscoll and Maura Healey. Maura's whole background has been in law, just not understanding what it's like to own small business, small pieces of real estate, developing real estate, and what residential developers are looking for, and instead thinking somehow they're going to be the people to find the solution. It's as simple as just talking to people and understanding the market.
So, yeah, no, that's really interesting. So it sounds like you have concerns about the MBTA Communities Act. Is it because it kind of you see it as a state coming in and kind of prescribing a solution, or that it doesn't I mean, it sounds like you feel it's not getting to the market, the issue of freeing up the market to to supply the demand that we need.
That's what you just said. It's that everything you just said, meaning that I think it's when a state comes in and says, "Hey, we know how to develop your town better than you do for housing." The answer is no, you don't. No, you don't. The state doesn't know how to handle new housing in Marblehead, new housing in New Bedford, new housing in some of these. There's 177 municipalities that are all essentially being put into 2 or 3 different buckets. And the solution is supposed to be, oh, one of these 3 solutions or buckets that you fall into, the policy that we're implementing is going to work. I mean, every single community is different. Every single need within that community is different. And so just by coming in and thinking that you're the solution is an overreach, but it also shows what happens when you do have a state overreach, which is you don't allow the communities to thrive the way that they need to thrive.
How, and I thought it was really interesting you said about the market forces and trying to cut through some of the red tape. So what can be done to do that? Because developers will complain as well about, it's just hard to get stuff developed, and on the local level, it's hard, takes a long time. Yeah, for any type of housing, how do we get the market rolling so we can get this more housing and more rental units in the market?
I think part of it is just communication. This is exactly a place where I could see a lieutenant governor making an enormous amount of value add, because it's understanding, okay, the residential developers, the commercial developers, because there's a ton of reuse available in different parts of the state where properties are vacant. Could they be reused as housing? Could they be reused as hotel? Are there commercial properties that could be reused as housing? So there's tons of ways to navigate that, but it's about communication. It's about saying, hey, here is what real estate developers are looking for. Here is the need that they see, the formulas they have, because they have to balance things like the loans that they're going to secure and public funds and federal funds, and then also talking to the communities themselves and saying, okay, is it that you are lacking 55 plus type of properties out there because your aging community wants to stay in their communities? Are you short on housing for young people because you're Northeastern and you're downtown Boston and the students want to stay in the area and work in the area? And so it really, I mean, what a better role. I can't think of anything better than a lieutenant governor being able to bridge those conversations in an effective manner.
And I want to turn it over to Amir and Tony, but just finally, like, can you give me some examples of, like, because you're out there in the real estate market, right? You're owning properties, operating. It sounds like you've maybe redeveloped some things. What are some of the kind of red tape issues with red tape that you've run into that just kind of like drive you crazy? Like, this is crazy. It's just taking so much time and it's ridiculous. That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think part of it is just the process itself on both securing federal funding or state funding to help you. So, for example of that would be brownfields tax credits, right? So you have sites that are really contaminated where you have this community, the community members themselves, along with the town or the city, saying, "Hey, let's do something about this," right? But then you have this long, tedious process to get the funds that you need to help do the cleanup. Right. So some of that is just red tape. And part of it is just saying, hey, is there a way to streamline these processes so that different developers can come in? And it's the same thing with when you're talking about taking a property that's commercial and turning it into residential, but it's already a mixed use zoning. So the community itself has said, hey, here's a place where we're comfortable with the mixture of housing and commercial. And the town is supportive of it because they need the revenue, and the developer is supportive of it, and yet they're not getting the state or the federal resources for maybe the affordability component. And so it's just really streamlining. And I know that sounds simple, but I think you probably, as an owner, you understand that when you have to start a process just to start another process, that extends the time, versus if you could just understand on day one, we're going to start all three paths at the same time. We're all trying to accomplish this together.
Sure. No, man. A
I hope
lot
that
of
makes
challenges.
sense. Tell me if that makes sense. You know?
It
Yeah,
makes
Yeah,
no,
it makes
no,
total
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Okay, good. Good.
So along those same lines, relate to a solution. So construction costs and compliance requirements make it extremely difficult to build modest workforce housing. What parts of the building code or the permitting process do you believe needs to be evaluated or restructured to allow landlords and property owners to build more housing, to expand inventory?
I hate to say it, but the easiest solution right there is the green energy stuff, right? The net zero stuff. And don't get me wrong, I think we can all agree that we want to take care of our planet, right? And we want to be mindful of the things that we're doing and things that we could do, modest things that we could do to improve the environment overall. So it's not trying to throw that entire concept out the window, but there's a balance when you all of a sudden say, hey, you're just trying to do an ADU, build an accessory dwelling unit on your property, or hey, we're gonna include a second floor to our existing house so that we can make it a multifamily, things like that, basic stuff. All of a sudden the construction costs go through the roof when all of a sudden they say, hey, you can't have certain utility hookups, or hey, you have to abide by these new policies. And by the way, some of those policies, they're they're not even built out yet. They're still in an experimental stage where a developer has to come to the planning board and say, we literally can't do that, and that delays it. Then all of a sudden you're going to the planning board again because you've now had to amend the plans that you put in place to do that development. And so there has to be some understanding that some of these rollouts of new policies, they're going to take time. And so you have to roll them out slower and just make those adjustments over time rather than say, nope, we're completely changing the system.
Have you run into that yourself with different things you're working on in terms of having to like having the costs go up because of the new kind of green regulations?
Everything on the ADU side, yeah.
Oh,
Everything
so
with
it's
with any type of major expansion. I do a ton in land development. So as you can imagine, when you're just putting the plans together to put to in front of the planning board or asking for some sort of variance, they're going to look at your plans and they're going to require that they meet certain standards at this point that are different. And some of those standards just don't. They literally won't even work. And so you're kind of educating at the same time as you're trying to get approvals.
in like for ADUs, I mean, how much like is there like a percentage in cost that it puts on these units or dollar amount that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was looking depending on the location, right? So we're doing some stuff right now on the Cape, right? So the Cape is always going to be a little bit more expensive for multiple reasons. Some of it is just the wetlands. A lot of our properties have some wetlands behind them.
Sure.
I would say that our average, I would assume all cost in somewhere about 330 a square foot. And with these new policies, I've gotten them as high as 520.
Wow.
Talk about margins. Again, I like land development for that reason because there tends to be more of a margin inland. Just when you're looking at the appreciation of land prices, they don't appreciate the same way as already completed projects. So there's more room for me to all of a sudden lose 20%, but
Sure.
uh, and sometimes I can make it up and, increasing the footprint or increasing the square footage. But no, absolutely. I've seen a pretty significant increase.
And does it trigger when you're doing the ADU, does it trigger like a requirement to like update the house itself or is it separate?
This
Like,
this is exactly what I mean. It's some of it is the education of the communities themselves. They all have their own policies, right? So if
oh, right.
you're implementing these new policies, that may trigger other things. So for instance, a good example of that would be septic systems. You know, all of a sudden you do something and they're like, oh, that's considered a new property. And in this specific town, if you have a new dwelling on your property, that now has to fit into this new regulation, and therefore it has to be green. And which is again, you know, this is just about being balancing green green policies with allowing people to still walk away from a project and have made some money. You know, you have to make some money on a project, otherwise you won't do it.
Sure, right. No, no one's going to do it to give away their money and go out of business. That would be a bad plan, right? You need to be able to, and it's hard when the costs are going up to estimate, as you're saying, what your margin's going to be, and it seems like it's more unpredictable than it has been before.
Absolute unpredictable is that's the name of the game. I think that's a perfect way to sum it up.
So a follow-up question
Yeah, good. Yeah.
along those lines. So you mentioned the need to balance between efficiency and green policy. Mass property owners are facing some of the highest energy costs in the country. What concrete actions would you take to address rate structures, surcharges, or regulatory policies that are driving these increases?
One is just removing some of the surcharges. And I have to be careful because the lieutenant governor is the lieutenant governor, right? So the governor is really, I can present this and say this is what I believe we should do. But the good news is, at least from the Republican side right now, we have three candidates, and I can tell you all three of them are going to be fiscally smart about some of these energy surcharges. And so I don't think it'll be difficult to get any of them on board if they're not already on board with just literally taking out some of these additional surcharges and getting rid of things like Mass Save. I know Mass Save sounds great, but for those who care about younger generations or the aging generation, Mass Save, you can only benefit from it if you're an actual property owner, and yet the amount of money that's put in through and apartment renters is a significant portion of it. So you have all these individuals who are paying into Mass Save through additional energy costs, but literally can't benefit from it. And so I would reevaluate Mass Save for sure. And then lastly, the DPU, who's responsible for signing off on these EverSource and the National Grid increase rates. I would look at those contracts and find out why they feel comfortable increasing these rates, and more importantly, why the DPU feels comfortable signing off on those increases. Because it's not just state policy. In my opinion, there's probably some abuse there.
That's a huge issue. The energy bills, I mean, and who's paying them, and whether it's falling on renters or communities that are less well off compared to other communities maybe benefiting more from these programs. Do you have any sense of how, in terms of whether how would we deal, in terms of dealing some of the natural or gas costs, some of the energy costs? Do you have any opinion on in terms of, a new gas pipeline or expanding that kind of infrastructure to try to take the edge off these winter increases we're seeing every winter with the
Yeah,
prices spiking?
I think there's a lot to be done just in taking the surcharges off and then looking at these increases that keep getting approved. But I will also say that the pipelines, when I researched it, right, and I'm sure you guys did too, and there was more to the story than simply, hey, the Healy administration just walked away from it, and they messed up. There's more to that. There were contract and negotiation issues that were part of it. So I need to really understand what that would look like, because there were some additional costs, infrastructure build out costs that were going to be put on the state in order to get those pipelines done. My sense, just in knowing kind of how the state has negotiated, or the Healy administration has negotiated so far, is that there was probably a room to make a deal there. It just needed to be negotiated correctly. And so I think in a way you have to go back to square one and just say to the marketplace, we're open for business. We're open for discussion. What do you have? What ideas do you have? What sources of energy do you have that can help us in reducing costs? We're open to discussing that in a reasonable way where everybody wins. So,
The last comment Anne made hits it on the head where everybody wins because that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to pass policies and promote policies where everybody wins, as opposed to playing the us versus them game, which appears to be a very easy way, a very short-sighted way that some elected officials try to win votes, which is unfortunate. And, in the spirit of bringing people together, I know you touched on the point earlier that there's no such thing as a one size fits all, but in general terms, have you seen any approaches to fixing the housing dilemma in other states that you think would be a good blueprint for Massachusetts?
yeah, for sure. You know what? Here's the great news when it comes to housing development in Massachusetts. I actually think that we're just way behind the ball on developing what we already have. And what I mean by that is there's $15 million that the EPA offered to do some remediation work in Massachusetts. We didn't even use it. We didn't even use it. And so the ability to just take what we currently have, whether it's property that we already own as a state, whether and developing it, whether it's looking at how you can do some cleanups on brownfield sites, whether it's reusing mill buildings and looking at them as sources of housing, which I successfully did in Rhode Island, whether it's looking at reusing, I think New York City is probably a good example of where they can reuse open vacant spaces as office spaces into and converting them into both hotels and apartment complexes. And so I don't think we even have to get that creative, and I definitely don't think we have to force anything on these communities. I think there is a ton of opportunity to just take advantage of what we already have.
On another subject, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. This is something else that we've been looking at, that we've been concerned about. The essence of it is that the government would essentially have the power to dictate who an owner gets to sell his or her property to. A tenant
Yep.
association could form. So hypothetically, if you wanted to purchase from me after our negotiation, where we negotiate on a price and everything else, the tenant association could step in and delay that deal between the two of us to give itself time to match your offer. And what has ended up happening, it was total disaster because, requesting, let's say, a 30-day amount of time would easily become 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. By the end of the process, the buyer in your position would just walk away. The tenant association ultimately would not be able to match the offer. And then the person like me who's trying to sell the property would have to start again from square one with the difference. And this happened in Washington, D.C., where let's say I find another buyer. Let's say Scott is the next potential buyer. I negotiate an agreement with Scott, thinking that I've already given the tenant association a chance. But lo and behold, the tenant association can then come back and hijack the interaction between Scott and I, and the vicious process just keeps repeating itself. And so in DC, what they found some years ago was that third-party speculators were stepping in to
Right.
purchase the
Right.
tenant's right, to force the owner to bring the price way the heck down so that they could essentially acquire the property for cheap. And if you're an owner who needs to sell quickly, either to cash out for retirement, or let's say, heaven forbid, there's an illness in the family or some emergency situation, what you have spent all that time working on to build up your retirement or to build up your savings goes out the window. And what they did, they tried to reform it in DC. I don't ultimately recall how that went, but the proponents of TOPA in Massachusetts, to their credit, and I'm not going to give them that much credit, but to their credit, they have listened to the criticism and they've tried to come and say, okay, we'll take that time window and will make it smaller. But even if they did make it smaller, I still think there are problems with this policy affecting my right to sell, affecting your right to buy. And we're not saying that you are some super duper conglomerate from out of state. You're an average investor looking to be a good homeowner, a good rental property owner. Why should you be forced away because the tenant's right to purchase supersedes your right? I mean, there's so many issues at play here, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but Anne, what do you think of this?
This is a great example of playing out what would happen if the governor came to me, right, and said, "Hey, I have this idea. Why don't we let tenants have the opportunity to purchase the property that they are living in if a landlord decides to sell?" And they came to me and said, "What do you think about that idea?" I would say, "That is completely unnecessary." And they would say, "Why?" And I would say, "Because any landlord who's going to sell a property that a tenant could purchase would already have gone to the tenant immediately, most likely the first person that they would go to, and say, 'Would you like to purchase your property?' Because they're already living there. They already understand that this is their home, and there's an ability to just go ahead and cut a deal without any of the normal closing costs or the marketing time or just the basic what could be at least 60 days, right? Because that's how long contracts usually last. And you just go to them and you say, "Do you want to buy the property?" I don't know. I don't think there's ever been a time where I haven't contemplated doing that or done that when I'm selling a property. So the idea of giving the tenant some additional stake in the property is literally like saying, "Hey, you have an interest, a legal interest in my property, even though you've done nothing to earn that interest besides living there." So it's just backwards in my mind. The only time I could see that even possibly working would be a scenario where I was selling a building and there were all these tenants, and the tenants said, "Hey, I can't buy the whole building, but I think we should do something." But even in that scenario, who's not going to listen to a bunch of tenants and cut a deal? You don't need to interfere as a state into that process. You're making it more complicated. And more importantly, exactly what you pointed out, which is other people will come in who have the means, will take advantage of the tenant's right and say, "Hey, maybe we can get this first deal." And so this is this is exactly my frustration with some of these policies, which is it's a state overreach and it's a state believing they understand how to do this. They don't, and they should just let the capital markets work the way that they're going to work, let the communication between the tenant and the landlord work as it is. And I promise you, the solution between the landlord and the tenant will be so much more amicable if they do it directly without one party having way more leverage over the other.
And in addition to that, what they found in DC was that less than 5% of the tenants ended up purchasing the properties that they were renting under that program. Tony, do you have any thoughts, any questions?
That's right. Wherever it's been implemented, especially in DC, it's been a complete failure. It just doesn't work. I don't see why or how the these policies keep resurfacing. They don't work in the places that they've been tried and experimented, and they just keep resurfacing in other locations. So no question, really, just a comment. I thought your answer was spot on, and it's common sense.
Common sense. It's common sense. And it wouldn't require anything more than somebody asking Tony or asking Amir or asking me, what would the impact be? We would all give the exact same feedback, which is that's just not a good idea.
What happens to your business or your properties if rent control, this question passes? I mean, and what are you seeing other people, that you deal with in the real estate business? How are they preparing or potentially preparing or looking at a change here that if this passes?
So funny. So I was talking to Amir earlier. I think some people know that I got caught in a situation in Portland, Maine, because I'm here because my tenant's hot water ran out, and
Oof,
I had a plumber come twice and didn't fix it, and so I started to get really concerned about just having to do it myself. But
sure.
I'm doing work. I'm owning property in Portland, Maine, and Portland, Maine has rent control issue. It's not
Ah,
full rent control, but
yeah.
they're doing essentially a cap. And it's I would say it's probably 70% of what we're seeing in Massachusetts on the rent control policy, right? And all the impacts are happening to me that you would expect. Like, I, as a landlord, I have to really count every penny and decide what I'm investing in my property, because my rents aren't going to go up. I think everything that you expect to happen, everything that has historically happened, as somebody who is literally working in Portland, Maine, I can at least come to you guys and say, hey, there's nothing new about 2026. 2026 rent control is going to have the exact same impact that it had in the 80s and the 90s and what we're seeing right now in Manhattan.
So what are you doing to, get your own message out? Are you meeting with like local Republican town committees, or how's your campaign going?
My campaign is awesome, and I will tell you, I'm very proud of my campaign. I started with zero, so zero followers, zero supporters. I don't think I had much besides Wayland, Massachusetts, because I'm a select woman for Wayland,
Sure.
much name recognition. But I've been to over 76 different events throughout the state in different municipalities, and so I've had the opportunity to literally. Last night I was just in the Berkshires. I've been in Orange. I've been in Worcester. I've been in all the different parts of Plymouth County. I've been literally all over the state, and we've had close to 5,000 followers right now. I've been invited into groups like your own, where all I'm doing is saying how I feel, and it's resonating. And I don't think it's magic. I don't think it's even politics. I think it's just me saying, this is my vision for the role, and this is what I would support, and putting stakes in the ground. And these are just so common sense. I When Amir and I connected, I don't think he was like, hey, I believe in Anne as a politician. I think he was like, she understands what small property owners are like, because she is one. So it's built very grassroots.
Do you have any other candidates on the Republican side that you're backing or like their policies?
Um, Biggest impact that I've seen is Shauna O'Connell in Taunton. Um, Man, I just think, I really dug into what she's done and the decisions she's made. She got reelected, so there's nothing coming up. But if somebody said, hey, who's somebody that you're seeing? Ken Sweezy. He's kind of the next generation of what you're seeing in Massachusetts. He's young, he's motivated, he's hungry to help his community. I think from the gubernatorial side, we have three candidates who are going to give Healy a run for her money. They're very capable. They're very successful individuals. They're putting their money where their mouth is. So I'm very proud of each one of them. We have some candidates who are running for real purposes and community purposes, like Manny Silva, who's out there right now, and he's running on his principles. And so, off the top of my head, I would say those are people that come to mind immediately.
Sure. But no one on the Republican gubernatorial side. I mean, like Keneally or Shortsleeve
That's
or
super.
Minogue that you're backing or think you'll back.
I think I'm backing the Republican Party. And what I mean
Okay.
by that is I want to see who they pick. The convention is coming up April 25th.
Yep.
And I purposely ran independent, right? So I purposely want to have my coalition that is supported and driven by the people of Massachusetts. And so I can come to the table and say, hey, I have some leverage. Just because you're the governor, I got some leverage. I got the people behind me, and I'm saying the things that resonate with them. But it's going to come down to you guys. It's going to come down to voters who, independent voters and Republican voters who say, this is the guy who represents us. This is the guy who resonates with us. And I'll be really curious to see who it is and why you guys pick him.
In like let's say you get the nod at the convention, you move forward. I mean, you're in a debate with Kim Driscoll. I mean, what are some things you get up there you'd want to grill her on or ask her or have her explain in terms of her policies or her approach or what she's been doing?
honestly, I feel like I have a very strong background in economic development. So that's probably something I would hammer because her policies, in my opinion, just aren't good business. I'm also an entrepreneur and a small business owner, and that's my world. And so that would be an area that I would feel like I excelled at. And so I'd say, hey, what were you thinking, in putting certain policies in place? What were you thinking by not getting involved in local communities? And most importantly, and I think this is what would separate Kim and I, why have you done nothing more with the lieutenant governor position? You are literally a ribbon cutter for the governor. And I understand that maybe there's, not specific duties or obligations that are, written out in the description of what a lieutenant governor is, but don't you have some policies, some personal things that you're trying to get done on behalf of the people that you represent? And why don't you go do those?
You said policy. What are some of the things that she's been doing that you just really disagree with? That policies that you think are counterproductive as a business owner, or in terms of economic development, or just doing business in the state?
He's not speaking up. She's not speaking up. She's letting these policies go without any thought, in my opinion. I have heard positive things about Kim's ability to communicate with individuals. So I don't see that there's probably a lack of understanding of like, hey, let me talk to, small property owners to find out how they feel. So if you're allowing the implementation of policies like the MBT communities, depriving the state of the audit, which is really important. And I mean, some of even some of the parental rights issues that I've been hearing about, she's smart enough, and I think she's capable of communicating with all of these groups to hear them and to react and to possibly endorse solutions. And instead, I've just seen her continuously support the policies that the governor supports.
And with regard to transparency, when it comes to a report that I think candidate Keneally brought forth, he discovered or drew attention to the fact that the administration gave money to a hate group that was saying pretty nasty things about police and property owners, calling them bad names, and more than that, calling, for example, landlords land bastards, saying that police were expletives. I don't want to get too much into it, but it just struck me as interesting that a challenger would bring that out. I'm not saying that the governor or the administration did it intentionally, but it was pretty alarming that that happened. And at the same time, in the housing realm, just to kind of bring it all together, we have these other proposals out there coming from the same type of people with the same type of ideology, where they want to make it illegal to do a tenant credit check, where they want to hide all eviction records if they can. And then you mentioned the audit. So I think what brings all of these issues together is a fundamental lack of, or maybe even a willful lack of transparency. How would you address all of that to bring safety and responsibility back to government?
I would not allow any of that to happen in general, right? It almost doesn't even matter what group you're attacking from the state level. It's the fact that you're attacking a group and you're trying to openly say this specific group is a terrible group and we should all, expose them and say negative things about them. And you'll find, I think, a lot of the Healy administration, a lot of those groups are groups that they think that voters, especially their voting base, may say, yeah, we're the working people and these groups are more wealthy or they have more power. And that storyline of the Healy administration representing a certain dynamic or a demographic in Massachusetts. The reality is you're splitting people apart by doing that. When you take your leadership responsibilities and use it to essentially separate different people and make them opposition. No. Oh, I have no time personally for that stuff in general. So identity politics or the divisiveness, it's just not productive. in my opinion. And so, and it's exactly what I think you're almost alluding to, which is when you aren't, when you're talking about that, but then you're not showing the budget, what you're really doing is just deferring people's focus to something else, something, that they're going to fight about, versus somebody saying, wait, where's the audit? And then everybody says, yeah, didn't I vote for the audit? So you're deferring their attention by saying, we don't like this group of people. It's a waste of time and energy, and it should, any administration doing it should be looked at with scrutiny.
As Amir mentioned, in the spirit of collaboration, we can all agree small property owners are critical to the Commonwealth housing stock. As Lieutenant Governor, how do you see the state partnering with small property owners, bringing us to the table rather than regulating us out of the market?
That's exactly what I would do. It's exactly what you just said, which is bring you to the table and try to make it as easy as humanly possible for you to expand and not be held up by red tape. Small property owners they are, especially in Boston, and you guys know this, they tend to be the first people into a new community that's going to grow. They tend to be, oh, let's take this one street of properties, whether it's multifamily, whether it's single family homes, whether it's rundown buildings, and let's turn them into something special. And in doing that, they revitalize a lot of communities, a lot of streets. And in doing that, all of a sudden those areas become of interest to larger developers. And that's really how it works. And so I would bring that discussion to the table, and I would ask you to come to the table with me.
Thank you, Anne. I think there are two key takeaways from this conversation, among other takeaways. Number one, it's important for the government to communicate with the small property owners and to collaborate with them on how to provide more housing while keeping it affordable, because that's what a lot of us do, and we actually know about the business. And number two, as you indicated, when extreme policies like rent control get implemented, it's awful hard to get rid of them afterwards. You gave the example of New York City, where people want to dismantle it, but they don't know how. And that kind of reminds me about what happened in Massachusetts in 1994 during the ballot campaign. Reportedly, the people who lived in the places that had rent control supported it because they were reluctant to give it up. And when you think about it, that's not surprising because with all the activist muscle behind the policy, along with the political circus and the dramas, a lot of people can get influenced. I believe they were influenced, and I believe that a lot of them were unsure about what might happen next. But the key point is this. About 10 years later, once they had a chance to experience what life was like without rent control, there was another opportunity to bring it back in the city of Cambridge, where the people were asked to vote on a home rule petition to revive rent control. And ultimately, the people of Cambridge, including the renters, voted against rent control by the margin of 61% to 39%, which was a landslide in the same city that gave birth to the most extreme version of the policy in Massachusetts. That's very telling. We can also look to the example in St. Paul, Minnesota. A few years ago, they implemented rent control in St. Paul, and so people and businesses migrated to neighboring Minneapolis in what became a tale of two cities. And what happened next surprised a number of people because the rent in free market Minneapolis went down in conjunction with increased supply, while the rent in rent-controlled St. Paul went up in conjunction with reduced supply and reduced development. And so the mayor of St. Paul tried to roll back rent control, but he hasn't been successful over the past 2 to 3 years. And that's a warning call for people in Massachusetts. They had better be listening to this because this ballot question features the most strict version of rent control in the country. And once it gets implemented, if it does get implemented, heaven forbid, it's going to be awful difficult to roll it back. So people better be paying attention to that, and they better vote against it. With that, I would like to thank Anne Brensley once again, along with Tony Lopes and Scott Van Voorhees. It was a great panel and a great conversation. And folks, please remember to donate to SPOA at spoa.com/join. That's www.spoa.com/join. Please support us, please donate, and please become a member. Because when you do that, you're not only supporting reasonable housing policies, but you're also supporting all the hardworking small property owners and entrepreneurs who not only work hard to keep housing more affordable, but who also give jobs to other businesses that are key in keeping the housing maintained. The plumbers, the electricians, the carpenters, and the list goes on. Because as small landlords, we play an important role in giving jobs to other people while putting roofs over people's heads, which ultimately makes our neighborhoods and our economy stronger and safer. Thank you very much.